Before he was president, governor, or even a state senator, Jimmy Carter's first political office was on the Sumter County School Board in rural South Georgia, filling a seat vacated when his father passed away in 1953. On this episode of Recollecting Carter, I talk with Dr. Jason Berggren about how understanding Carter's earliest political appointment helps us to better appreciate just how much he evolved over the course of his career.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
The time for racial discrimination is over.
That I will faithfully execute
an undiminished, ever-expanding American dream.
the office of President of the United States.
The struggle for human rights overrides all differences of color or nation or language.
And will, to the best of my ability,
It is a crisis of confidence.
preserve, protect, and defend
To remove the light of war, the threat of war, would be the overwhelming dream that I would have.
the Constitution of the United States.
We will not learn how to live together in peace by killing each other's children.
So help me God.
Yes, I'm Dr. Jason Berggren, a professor of political science at Georgia Southwestern State University. I've been teaching the American politics curriculum since 2009.
Carter started his higher education career at Georgia Southwestern.
Correct.
Were you already a Carter expert?
That's a key reason why I came to Georgia Southwestern, because I did want to explore it more. Prior to that, I was a teaching fellow at the University of Georgia. When this position opened, I wanted to come here since we're only about 10 miles from Plains. It's hard to beat the proximity and the vantage point I have here, especially focusing on the local angles that do not necessarily make it into some of the major publications or media coverage of Mr. Carter.
I definitely want to get into some of that expertise, but for listeners that have never been to Plains, have never been to South Georgia, maybe have never been to a rural area, paint a picture of what it's like in America's Plains and the surrounding region.
Yes, this is small town America, Main Street America. We're a county, maybe about 20,000 or so, and Plains being a town of about 500. Not a lot has changed over the decades. Some of my expertise here looking at the school system and locating some of the previous school sites, had my students go out and to see them. And some of those sites are on long dirt, clay, back roads, and I always warn them, if you're going to go visit those sites, don't do it on a rainy day or when it has rained heavily in recent days. Of course, like the rest of Georgia and the rest of the South, it has modernized, it has made necessary changes, but retained that small town America feel. And with the Carters coming to this area, I think it has that special quality to it, the fact that we are home to a president and first lady. It magnifies us in a way different from surrounding counties here in Southwest Georgia. It is a good place to work. I've enjoyed working here these past years, and that's one of the things we often say about Georgia Southwestern. We're a small school, a little more than 3,000, but we get to know our students, where you get to know one another.
In your previous work, you have contended that not only Carter's upbringing, but really his coming of age politically in Plains has a much bigger impact than a lot of historians might account for. Why don't we hop in there? Tell us how Carter got started in politics.
Well, he does come from a political family, and I don't want to spend too much time on that, in the sense that I think the key story is when he returns home in 1953 from the Navy, but it is still an essential part. His father, Earl Carter, was involved in politics. He was a member of the Sumter County Board of Education, and he served on that up until his death in July of 1953. He had also been elected to the Georgia State House of Representatives, and he was in his very first few months. He'd finished his first session in the state legislature just before he passed away. His Uncle Buddy, right, Alton Carter, was also involved in politics as a mayor of Plains. His maternal grandfather, Jim Jack Gordy, had also been involved within politics. He's got that connection, and in that sense, I think people forget that he's not a political outsider when he comes back home and he begins to start exploring politics and filling his father's shoes. I mean, he comes back home out of the Navy, and that's of course another story, in October 1953. And what's kind of fascinating within that first year he comes home, him and his wife, Miss Rosalind Carter, they don't have a lot of money. They're in public housing. The only president to actually live in public housing. They lived there for a year. But that year is when the political connection that would launch him into his first offices begins. By January, just a few months in, by January of 1954, there is a school referendum on consolidation, trying to modernize and improve public schooling, basically taking a bunch of schools where resources have been widely distributed and maybe the facilities, they're older, outdated, maybe they need a lot more investment to make them work better and serve students. The idea is to consolidate them into stronger schools where we can pour our resources into them and offer our students the best possible curriculum and to offer great job opportunities and job security for our staff and for our teachers. This was an issue that his father had took up on the school board. It was an issue that his father believed in and was working towards up until the time of his death. The American City School Board, separate from the county at that time, both school systems finally agreed, let's put it on the ballot and let's have a vote. That January, after the Carters had returned home, it had failed. But what's kind of fascinating about it is that that would be the same major signature issue that Jimmy Carter would take in his time on the school board and made a name for himself. Jimmy would do the same thing. After Jimmy Carter comes home in October of 53, by December 1955, he's on the Sumter County School Board. He is chosen in December of 1955, and it would be, in fact, the very same seat that Mr. Earl Carter had held. But I do want to say another point of that first year back. 1954 was an election year for governor. It was a very important race. It was being decided who would replace Herman Talmadge, the sitting governor, but was term limited. In May of 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its 9-0 ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education to declare that racially segregated schools mandated by the state, mandated by government entities, is unconstitutional. And that there is no way in which you can make them materially and immaterially equal to satisfy the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So that's the context. He's coming home, trying to fill his father's shoes, adopting community roles during that time. And one of the things is becoming involved in the electoral process as a voter. It's the environment of the Brown decision and the aftermath of the Brown decision. You have a race for governor animated by how Georgia politicians react to the Brown decision. It's not a positive reaction. It is part of the mass resistance among white Southern leaders that begins to take place. And it's in this environment that Carter's emerging as a voter, filling in Mr. Earl Carter's political shoes. One of the community roles that Jimmy Carter takes is that he joins the Plains Lions Club. He is elected as one of the executive officers. His first cousin, Hugh Carter, is the president of the Lions Club. And the Lions Club hold a political rally for the candidates for governor in Plains. According to the local paper, more than 1,500 attend this rally. It is said in the local paper that this was the largest political gathering seen, at least up until that point, in Plains. 3 of the 9 candidates for governor come in person and give a talk. The other 6 campaigns had local representatives that spoke on their behalf. And part of the monies that were raised during that rally was to go to a local community improvement project, having a swimming pool constructed, and Mr. Jimmy Carter was in charge of that project as well. But this is where I think the coverage of Mr. Carter and this time period, I think sometimes gets submerged. To fully understand him as a politician, as a political leader, and the growth that he had, it's crucial to understand this time period and his years on the Sumter County Board of Education. What's fascinating is that in Carter's writings, and this does not appear a lot in works about Jimmy Carter, but Jimmy Carter had written that in 1954, he cast his first vote since he was back home, as did Mrs. Carter, cast their first vote for governor. And Jimmy had backed a man by the name of Fred Hand. Fred Hand did attend that rally in person in Plains. Fred Hand was the Georgia Speaker of the House of Representatives. He was one of the top tier candidates. I mean, he didn't ultimately do well. I believe he finished a distant fourth, around 12% or so. He was from Pelham, Georgia, not too far from here in Mitchell County. And Jimmy backed Fred Hand. Now, Jimmy had mentioned in his writings that he backed Fred Hand because of a local connection, family connection. After all, he's a nearby neighbor, if you will, from Mitchell County, just to the south of us. But also that his grandfather, I believe on his father's side, used to have some business dealings in timber and turpentine with Mr. Hand's father. So he mentions that kind of personal connection. Voters have many different reasons as to why they're attracted to candidates. But I think it is important to know, again, where Mr. Carter's coming from politically and that environment. It's the post-Brown South, Deep South, Southwest Georgia South, right? Rural South. To be politically viable in that environment for a white politician, you have to be a segregationist. And all of the candidates were segregationists, all 9. The question, of course, is by degree of one's commitment to segregation. Fred Hand is a strict or militant segregationist, and that's who Mr. Carter had backed in 1954. In fact, by looking at the campaign ads in the local paper here, the America's Times Recorder, there are several ads from the Sumter Friends of Hand for Governor. And a couple of the ads use the title Southern Tradition Kept in Hand. And the leading issue that Hand discusses maintaining segregation, even if it means he has to go to jail and conduct the business of governor from a jail cell. He will do so rather than mix the races. As an observer of Mr. Carter's political career, of his great political contributions, I think it's important for those who study him, even admire him, know where we're starting from.
I think what's interesting about this is, like you alluded to, is in all the major biographies, this section is glossed over at best.
One biographer called him a Southern liberal and had said that the Carters were the exception within Plains when it came to the issue of segregation. In fact, the issue was racial integration, that the Carters were the exception. It's like, I have to be blunt about it. There is no evidence to support that.
Right.
Everything is to the contrary. Even his first vote for governor, the issue of consolidation of schools, he supported through the referendum, was about white schools. The black schools had their own consolidation program, and the one that Jimmy Carter was a part of, his early period on the school board, was about the equalization. When Jimmy Carter graduated from Plains High School in 1941, in the county system alone, there were 39 black schools. There were 10 white schools. By the time Jimmy Carter, 20 years later, left the school board and went to the Georgia State Senate, there were 5 white schools and 4 black schools. That's consolidation, but they're going on different tracks. The ones that involved the white schools in the county and the city, those are the ones that involved the referendum. And that's the one that his dad had supported, that went to the vote after he had passed in January of 1954 when Jimmy was chairman of the school board. and that went to a vote in July of 1961. But this was to maintain segregation. There was no effort to integrate schools during the 1950s and early 60s. Ernest Van Diver, no, not one. Not one, in terms of being an African-American student, was enrolled in one of the historically white schools, not until the city system in the fall of 1964. What I think is fascinating is that a change would take place. And this is something I always would want listeners and those interested in understanding Carter. There is a point at which he becomes the outsider, and that was with that referendum vote and consolidating the city schools, white schools, and the county white schools. Jimmy became the lead person on this issue. I mean, it's documented. He took the case across the county. His name's mentioned in local papers, leading the Yes campaign on consolidation. He's the chairman of the county board. He writes 5 articles on behalf of both boards for the America's Times Recorder, defending why it's in the best interests of teachers, of students, of families, of the whole area to have consolidated schools. But those opposed believed that it was a covert effort to mix the races, that Mr. Carter was an integrationist. In this environment, in this circumstance, Jimmy Carter starts to feel politically as an outsider, alienated as a political actor, alienated from those who he's known his whole life, even family. You have that as an indirect way of looking at the outsider role. This is of interest to Carter watchers and Carter researchers. When's the earliest Mr. Carter go on record that we have on saying we've got to move forward? Well, the earliest I can find is a speech he gave at Georgia Southwestern when he was a state senator in June 1964. This is a month before the Civil Rights Act. He asked the crowd, can we be satisfied with the rate of our pace? He basically tells the crowd, we have to be ready for change. This has been an obstacle. Too many things have been an obstacle. He even identifies the Civil War and the memories and the holding on to the past as an obstacle for the greatness that Georgia can be. He even mentions his vision for an America in which our Southland can find a place of leadership. He wants the South to lead the country in all respects. It can't if race continues to be an obstacle. This is the earliest that at least I can find of any evidence where he's willing to go on record, and we have something preserved where he takes a stand that says, look, we got to move forward on this. We've got to accept it. Now, he's a state senator at this time, and soon, within 2 years, he'd be running for governor. If you want to understand somebody, you got to get to the beginning. Well, this is the beginning. And I think that's what makes it so valuable in showing how human he is and how much growth there was. Look at all the people at that time that did not have the kind of growth that he had. He could recognize the need for change. And I think one of the ways he found it was education. It's important to know where he come from, the transitions that begin to take place. And by the time he's in the state Senate, he's ready to move forward. It's important to see his school board years, because after all, that loss of the referendum, it's his first campaign. It is a defeat. And he has noted in several places that that was one of the motivations of why he wanted to go to Atlanta, why he wanted to seek higher offices. You know, his program of reform, it has a ceiling here. It's going to be limited here. People are not ready. So maybe he can take the case higher to Atlanta, to Washington. And when you consider the federal department, right, U.S. Department of Education is created when Jimmy Carter is president, of the United States. And he references his long career. This is where it starts.
Yeah.
It's in America, Plains, Georgia. It's in Sumter County, and it's on the school board, and it begins in that first year he comes home from the Navy.
Well, thanks so much for taking us back to the beginning of Carter's political career and making such a convincing case for how influential it was on his later career.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Recollecting Carter is produced by me, Jason Lee Guthrie, with support from Georgia Humanities and the Liebner Cooper Family Foundation. Original music and sound design by Joel Corey. Logo design by Whitney Matheson. Archival media provided by the Carter Center. Special thanks to my intern Michael Smith and my students at Clayton State University who have contributed to this podcast. You can connect with the show online at recollectingcarter.com.